Roughly 4,300 years ago, a man who called himself King of the Universe built the first empire the world had ever seen. And within a few short generations, it had vanished so completely that we still cannot find the city he ruled it from. Every textbook tells you this is a story about genius and pride, a self-made conqueror, a golden age, a curse, and then barbarians at the gates. But that explanation has always had a hole at its center. Empires do not rise from one man, and they do not fall from one curse. I went looking for the Akkadians, expecting the story of a great king. What I found instead was buried in dirt, in river silt, and in the genetic record itself. And what the evidence actually revealed was not what anyone was taught. It begins with the scale of the thing. Start with the world that already existed, because the world Sargon walked into was not empty, and that is the first thing the standard story gets wrong. By the time he arrived, southern Mesopotamia had been building cities for more than 1,000 years. The Sumerians were there first, raising the first true urban centers anywhere on Earth. Towering walls, temples called ziggurats that stood like the skyscrapers of their day. They had invented writing, first to count grain and then to record their own history. They had bent the rivers into irrigation canals and pulled vast surpluses out of a land with almost no natural resources. Civilization was already ancient, already wealthy, already old. Then came the man the textbooks build the whole story around. We do not even know his birth name. He took one for himself, Sharukin, meaning legitimate king, and we remember him as Sargon. The legend says he began as a cupbearer to the king of the city of Kish, rose through the ranks, and seized power for himself. He marched on the south, defeated the Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggisi, and forged something that had never existed before. A single empire stretching, by his own account, from the Persian Gulf toward the shores of the Mediterranean. Most historians regard it as the first true empire in human history. There is a story about how he came into the world that you may find strangely familiar. His mother, a priestess, set him adrift on the river in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch, where a water drawer found him and raised him as his own. If that sounds like another, far more famous river basket story told many centuries later, that is worth sitting with. Though here it is legend, not scripture, and we should treat it as such. And here's the thing that refuses to make sense. This empire was so famous, so foundational, that every power to rise in the region for the next 2,000 years tried to imitate it. Kings would still be calling themselves King of Akkad long after Sargon was dust. His name became the very definition of what a ruler was supposed to be, and yet his capital city, the place he built and called Agade, the beating heart of the first empire on Earth, has never been found. Not by Woolley, not by anyone since. We can read about it in thousands of clay tablets. We simply cannot stand inside it. The standard answer to how this empire rose and fell begins with the man. The truth begins somewhere else entirely. It begins with the people he ruled, and with the question of who the Akkadians actually were. Ask most people who the Akkadians were, and you will get some version of the same answer. A foreign people, outsiders who came down out of the north or the desert, conquered the Sumerians and replaced them. A new race overriding an old one. It is a clean story. It is also wrong. The Akkadians were not strangers to Mesopotamia. They were neighbors. They spoke a Semitic language, yes, different from Sumerian, but they had been living side by side with the Sumerians for centuries before Sargon was ever born. They worshipped the same gods. They lived in the same cities. They farmed the same fields the same way. By Sargon's day, the two peoples were so woven together that telling them apart on the ground would have been nearly impossible. What Sargon achieved was not the arrival of a new people. It was the rise of a new kind of power, built on top of a population that had been there all along. Now, this is the point where I have to be honest with you about the evidence, because honesty is the whole reason to trust the rest. This is exactly where the genetic record is thinnest. The heat of the Mesopotamian plains and the sheer depth of time are brutal on ancient DNA. The fragile genetic material in those earliest bodies has largely been destroyed. We do not have a clean library of genomes from the cities of Sargon's world the way we do from colder, kinder ground elsewhere. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But what we can lean on still points in one clear direction. Modern population genetics of the region shows deep, unbroken continuity, not a sudden rupture. The rise of Akkad does not appear as a genetic break in the record. The people in the ground before Sargon and the people in the ground after him were, in the main, the same population. The empire changed who held power. It did not change who lived there. So the meaning of the first empire shifts when you look closely. It was not one people overwhelming another. It was a single, radical idea pressed down onto an ancient population. Centralized power. A loyal administrative class answering to one man. A single language of state binding a patchwork of tongues together. The faces did not change. The system above them did. Which leaves a far more interesting question than the one we started with. If the Akkadians did not replace anyone, if they were a thin layer of new power resting on millions of unchanged people, then how did that layer ever hold together at all? And why, from the very first day, was it so dangerously fragile? The answer is that Sargon did not hold the empire together by winning hearts. He held it together by rewiring who owned everything. For more than 1,000 years, real power in the Sumerian cities had belonged to the priesthood and the old noble families. Single hereditary households controlled the temples, the land, and the wealth that flowed from both. When Sargon arrived, he broke them. He stripped the old families of their authority and handed it to hand-picked Akkadian governors, men loyal to him and to no one else, men who were allowed to keep a sizable share of the wealth for themselves. He did not ask them to believe in the empire. He gave them a personal stake in it. He made their fortunes depend on his survival. The land machine that followed was staggering. Estates that had belonged to temples for centuries were seized and redistributed. Under Sargon's son, Raimush, the empire carried out one of the largest land transactions in all of recorded history, roughly 134,000 hectares torn from the cities of Lagash and Umma, lands they had fought over bitterly for generations, and handed wholesale to a new landholding class of regime loyalists. Institutions, 1,000 years old, were dismantled inside a single lifetime. Then there was the propaganda, and Sargon was the first ruler we know of to weaponize it this way. He boasted, in writing, of the exact number of enemies his armies had killed, and swore to the accuracy of the count. No one had done that before. It was a deliberate cult of personality, rule through fear and awe. He made Akkadian the official language of administration, a single tongue stamped over a realm that spoke a dozen. And here's the tell. For all that wealth, all those armies, all that fear, the empire could never sit still. Every single reign opened with revolt. Sargon spent his rule putting down rebellions. His son Ramush faced near total uprising and answered it with slaughter, mass deportation, and what the documents can only describe as labor camps. Thousands killed, thousands more sold into slavery. The cities rose, were crushed, and rose again. Sit with what that means. An empire that has to reconquer itself every generation is not strong. It is brittle. The gold was real. The armies were real. But the foundation underneath them was thin, a layer of borrowed loyalty held down by force. And yet the empire did not break under rebellion. It survived the revolts. It climbed higher still, all the way to its absolute peak, under a king who looked at all of it and decided he was a god. That height is exactly where the real catastrophe was waiting. The peak had a name. Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, who ruled for 36 years and pushed the empire to its greatest size it would ever reach. This was the classical age of Akkad, the high point of its art and its wealth. We still have the great victory monument carved in stone that shows him climbing a mountain over the trampled bodies of his enemies, larger than every other figure, a horned helmet on his head. He renovated the most sacred temple in Mesopotamia, at the holy city of Nippur, and the records name the armies of specialists who built it: goldsmiths, sculptors, woodworkers, carpenters, brought in from across the empire. And somewhere in those 36 years, Naram-Sin did something no Mesopotamian king had ever dared. He declared himself a living god, not a servant of the gods, a god, king of the 4 quarters of the earth, demanding worship in his own lifetime. To understand how strange that was, remember his aunt. Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, installed as high priestess at the city of Ur, who wrote hymns to the gods so enduring that she is remembered today as the first author in human history known to us by name. One generation served the divine, the next claimed to be it. So when the empire fell, the storytellers knew exactly who to blame. They wrote a tale called The Curse of Agade, in which the gods, offended by Akkadian arrogance, send drought and the mountain people to wipe the city from the earth. It is a powerful story. It is also fiction, written generations after the fact, a cautionary tale about the danger of insulting heaven. It is not history, and we should not treat it as such. And here is where the standard story inverts completely. The truth is almost the opposite of a curse. Naram-Sin was not struck down by angry gods for his pride. The actual records show a capable, even pious ruler, the man who rebuilt that great temple grander than ever before. The morality tale told later about his downfall does not match what the evidence on the ground actually says. The empire was not punished for one man's vanity. Something far larger was moving against it. Something that did not care how many battles Naram-Sin had won, or how many gods he claimed to be. Something that no governor could bribe, no army could march against, and no king, however he styled himself, could command. It was not waiting in the palace. It was not hiding in the temple. It was in the soil itself, in the level of the rivers, in the air over the whole of the Near East. And modern science has finally learned how to read it. Around the year 2200 BCE, the sky over the Near East went quiet. The rains failed, and they did not come back for a very long time. We know this because the evidence was not written by any king. It was laid down in the ground itself. Around the turn of the millennium, scientists studied sediment cores drawn from the floor of the Gulf of Oman, layers of mud built up year by year over thousands of years. And in the layers dated to exactly this window, they found a sharp spike in wind-blown dust, the unmistakable signature of a sudden, severe, decades-long drying of the land. Scientists call it the 4.2 kilo-year event, a catastrophic aridification that struck right as the Akkadian Empire stood at its height. Then came the proof on land. In the empire's northern heartland, the archaeologist Harvey Weiss excavated a great city mound called Tel Leilin, and he found something chilling. The occupation layers, the steady record of people living and building, simply stopped. And above them lies a thick blanket of wind-blown silt, sterile and empty. A city abandoned. A whole region walked away from, sealed beneath the dust the drought had carried in. Now put the human scale on it. The rains failed. The Euphrates and the Tigris dropped. The marginal farmland in the north, the very land that fed the capital, turned to dust in the wind. Harvests collapsed. Famine spread. And the economy that the entire empire was built upon, the grain, the surplus, the tax, came apart at the seams. This was not a local misfortune. The same climate shock has now been tied to the fall of Old Kingdom Egypt and to the collapse of other Bronze Age states across the region. It was a global catastrophe, not a punishment aimed at one proud king. And the barbarians at the gates, the mountain people called the Akkadians, who the legends blame for the end, they did not topple a thriving empire. They moved into a starving, fracturing state that was already collapsing from the inside, and they took a capital that was already failing. They were not the cause. They were the scavengers that arrived after the wound. So look again at the curse of Agade. It was the story a later people told to explain a disaster they had no other way to understand. They reached for an angry god because they did not have sediment cores. The real culprit was the weather. The empire was finished. The capital was lost so completely we still cannot find it. But the genetic and cultural record refuses to let the story end there. At the level of the state, the fall was total. The dynasty that Sargon founded ended. The Akkadians ruled in his place, and the capital, Agade, the heart of the first empire on earth, vanished so completely from the map that no excavation in the centuries since has ever located it. As a political thing, the empire did not just fall, it was erased. But here is the distinction that changes everything. The empire died, the people did not. Start with the language. Akkadian, the tongue Sargon stamped over his realm as the language of administration, did not die with the dynasty that promoted it. It outlived the empire by roughly 1,500 years, spreading across the entire Near East to become the common language of diplomacy and trade, the lingua franca of kings and merchants, until Aramaic finally replaced it more than a millennium later. The empire was gone. Its language was still being written long after. The model outlived it too. Centralized government, provinces run by appointed governors, a single state language binding many peoples together. Every empire that rose in the region for the next 2,000 years borrowed that template. They called themselves King of Akkad long after Akkad was rubble, because Sargon had defined what a ruler was. And then there is the deepest thread of all. Here, again, I have to be honest about the limits, because the ancient genomes from this exact ground are scarce. But modern population genetics of Mesopotamia and the wider region points clearly toward deep ancestral continuity. The people living in these lands today descend, in a measurable biological sense, from the populations that lived through the Akkadian Age and through everything that came before it. Empires came and went above them. The bloodline ran underneath it all, unbroken. The empire was a chapter. The people were the book. So look one more time at that phrase, the first empire. What Sargon truly built was not a kingdom that endured. It lasted only a handful of generations before the drought took it. What endured was the template, copied for 2,000 years, and the demonstration, written into language and into blood, that the people of Mesopotamia were a continuous thread. Drought could interrupt it. Conquest could interrupt it. Collapse could erase the city and lose it to the sand forever. None of it could sever the thread itself. That is the truth the textbooks left out. Not a great man brought low by a curse. A brilliant, brittle experiment, undone by the weather, resting all along on a people far older and far more durable than the empire that briefly ruled them. The empire fell. The thread did not. Here is what stays with me after spending weeks inside this material. The fall of the Akkadians is not really the story of one genius king, and it is not the story of a curse. It is the story of a people who were always there, of a brilliant but brittle experiment held together by loyalty and fear, and of a climate catastrophe that no ruler, however he styled himself, could command. The textbooks handed us a great man and a tidy moral about pride. The evidence hands us something humbler and far stranger. an empire undone by the weather, resting on a population that outlasted it by 4,000 years. We still cannot find the city of Agade. We may never find it. But we can still find the Akkadians, in the languages we trace, in the institutions we inherited, and in the living. The empire fell. The thread held.